Today we're going to learn about radical form and how it's equal to rational exponent form. So when you see the word radical, all it means is that square root sign right there. Normally we take square roots, but you really can take a cube root or a fourth root or a fifth root, and so we'll learn about that. Rational exponents are just exponents that are fractions. So normally you're used to just regular numbers for exponents, but today we have fractions. So a really easy example is the square root of 4. Normally when you see that sign, you say square root, and there's actually a little tiny 2 right there by the radical sign. What that equals is 4 to the 1/2. So the 2's on the bottom because we're taking the square root, and a 1 is on top because the exponent on the 4 is really a 1. So if we write it the other way, 4 to the 1/2 power is 4 to the first power, and we're taking the square root of it. And normally you don't write the 2, so it's really just the square root of 4, and you don't normally write the 1 either. So basically what you have to remember is how to write the fraction. So if you remember that the number outside the radical sign is what root you're taking, then you'll remember that that number goes on the bottom of the fraction, because where do roots come from? They come from underground, right? So it's underneath the fraction. And then you just have to remember that the power, or the exponent on the number, is above the number, so the power goes on top. The other thing that you're going to notice is that sometimes you see parentheses, sometimes you don't, but this one that has the parentheses around the whole thing with the power on the outside, it's the same as having that power on the inside. So let's just try some of these so you can practice rewriting them. When we see 5 to the positive 1/3, we're going to write our radical sign and put the 5 underneath it. Since 3 is on the bottom, that's the root, so we put a little 3 right there, and then the 5 will be raised to the first power. You don't have to write the 1, so that's it. So we have the radical sign in a 4. The root is 4, because that's what's on bottom, and 4 is raised to the third power. Now normally you would go through and calculate these, but for this all we're doing is just rewriting them in the radical form, so later we'll learn how to simplify them. So next we have 10 to the negative 2 power, the negative 2/3. So anytime you see a negative exponent, all that means is you take whatever you have, and if it's on the top, you're going to put it on the bottom of a fraction and make it positive. So it's 10 to the positive 2/3, and we'll put a 1 on top. So it's 1 over 10 is the base, the 3 is on the bottom, so we'll take the cube root, and the 10 will be squared. In the next row, we're doing the same thing, but we just have more than one thing inside these parentheses now. That means that the 4/3 is applying to the 3 and the x. So what it means is the 3 and the x are both going to be underneath the radical sign, underneath that bar. So the root is 3, and the power is 4, and so we make sure the 4 is on both the 3 and the x. We'll put them in parentheses. On 1e, we have a negative power, so this is going to go underneath the fraction bar, and the 1/3 will become positive, and we'll put a 1 on top, and now we'll just write what a to the 1/3 power is. The root is 3, and the a will be to the first. We don't have to write it, so that would be it. On 1f, I gave you a decimal for a power, but we don't want decimals for our powers. So we're going to change that decimal to a fraction. If you know what 0.7 is, or 0.75 is as a fraction off the top of your head, that's great. But if you're unsure, you can always type 0.75 and then math, enter, enter. And it will tell you that the fraction is 3/4. So we will write the 10m both underneath the radical sign. The root is 4, because that's what's on bottom, and the power is 3. And since both the 10 and the m are to the third, we'll put them in parentheses. Now we're going to do the same thing, except for we'll take radical form and put it in exponential form. So we see our base is 4. The root is 3, so that's the bottom of the fraction, and the power is 5, so that goes on top. That's it. We could simplify this, but we're going to save that for example 3, and that's a 5 right there. All right, the next one, we have a 4 for the base. The root is not there, so we know it's really a 2. So the root is 2, and the power is 5. On 2c, we have the base is 2, the root is 5, and the power on the 2 is a 1. So that's just 2 to the 1/5. The next row, now we have some numbers and letters, so we still treat everything the same way. The base is a, the root is 4, so that goes on the bottom, and the power is 5. On 2e, see how the 2 and the x are both underneath that square root sign? So I'm going to make sure I put the 2 and the x inside parentheses, and then we're going to raise it to the, since this is a square root, the root is 2 and the power is 3. So it's 2x to the 3/2. If we didn't have the parentheses around the 2x, then the 3/2 would only be applying to the x. So make sure you put the parentheses. The last one we have everything on the bottom. So what that means is that our exponent must have been negative. So we'll just do everything the same and make sure we have a negative exponent. Our base is 5k, so we'll put 5k and we'll put it in parentheses. The root is 3, the power is 2, and since it's underneath the fraction bar, we'll make it negative. So it's 5k to the negative 2/3. If you have a graphing calculator available, it will be great, so you can practice how to type these in the calculator. If not, you can do it when you get to class. But the normal buttons on your calculator type the square root. When you type second x squared, it gives you the square root. So you need to tell it to do other roots. So if you want to do the cube root, there's actually a function for the cube root because it's fairly common. You just press the math button, and then option 4 is cube root, and then you'll type in whatever number is underneath for x. Hit enter, and you're done. Since you can take any root, like the 4th root, 5th root, 6th root, if there's an option for the nth root, when n stands for any number, in that case, you have to type in what root you're taking first, then press math, and then option 5 is the nth root, and then you'll type in whatever you're taking the nth root of. So let's practice those. If you have a calculator, you'll see 8 to the 1/3 power. You could just type 8 caret 1/3, and it'd give you the answer. But you might not always see it written that way. You might see it written as a radical, which would be the root is 3, the power is 1, so you might see the cube root of 8. So if you want to do the cube root, you press math 4, type in the 8, and you'll get 2. Either way you type it in. For 3b, you can type 64 to the negative 1/3 power, or, since it's negative, we can put 1/64 to the 1/3. And if we rewrite that using a radical, it's the cube root of 64. So if you type the cube root of 64, so math 4 and then 64, it will tell you 4. So the answer there is 1/4. For 10,000 to the 1/4, we can rewrite that using a radical, or you're welcome to just type 10,000 to the 1/4 power, but maybe it's not written that way. Maybe you see the 4th root of 10,000. So if you would like to type that on your calculator, first you'll type the 4, because that's the root you're taking. Then you'll type math and option 5, and you'll see the 4 and the root sign come up on your screen. Then you can type the 10,000, and it will equal 10. So what we're finding out, like, what does the 4th root mean? It means you multiplied 10 together 4 times, and it equaled 10,000. And what does the third root of 64 equaling 4 mean? Well, it means 4 times 4 times 4 is 64. And the cube root of 8 means 2 times 2 times 2. The cube root, there's 3 of them. 2 times 2 times 2 is 8. All right, last row. We have a power to a power. Anytime we see a power to a power, we first maybe think about multiplying them together. So if you multiply 6 times 1/3, it'll be 6 divided by 3, which is going to be 2. So this is just x to the second. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it would be to write it in radical form, which would be x to the 6th. The root would be 3, and it all would be raised to the first power, so we don't really have to write that. And then you think to yourself, what do you have 3 of that equals x to the 6th? Well, x to the second times x to the second times x to the second would be x to the 6th. Oops. And so that's why it's x to the second. The other thing you can notice now is that 6 divided by 3 is 2. So either way, I'll show you both, but you can do these either way. Let's try 3e. All of this is raised to the 1/2 power. So I'm going to rewrite it as the square root, because the root's 2, of 16x to the 10th. So I need to take the square root of 16. I know that's 4. I also need to take the square root of 10. Well, 10 divided by 2 is 5. Another way to do that would be to distribute the 1/2 power to all the exponents inside, which would give you 16 to the 1/2 times x to the 10 times 1/2, which is 5. And then you can do the square root of 16, x to the 5th, which is still 4x to the 5th, either way you do it. Last example, you can see we have a negative. So it's going to be 1 over 243 x to the 15th to the 1/5 power. So I can rewrite it as, this is a 5, so it's the 5th root of 243 x to the 15th. So the 5th root of 243, you're going to type 5, and then you'll type math 5, and then 243. When you do all that, you'll get 3. And then what's 15 divided by 5? It's x to the 3rd. So I'm going to leave it like that. I actually think that way is a little easier than distributing. So we'll leave it like that.